Welcome. This is the video lecture on market failure. I'm Professor Cherry. Now, along the way, we've developed a demand and supply model that illustrates how markets work and show how effective markets can be in allocating scarce resources and generating welfare for market participants and society in general. But along the way, we've mentioned some issues that can cause markets not to work very well. In this section, we're going to discuss in detail two issues that receive most of the attention: externalities and non-market goods. So first, let's start with externalities. An externality is when an action of one agent has an impact on the well-being of another agent. In a market, this means that you have a buyer and a seller. Those two market participants come together voluntarily because that transaction benefits both sides of the transaction. What this is talking about is a third person or third party bystander that's not voluntarily engaging in that transaction, but they're affected by that transaction. So in essence, that market transaction has an external effect on a bystander that's not engaging in that transaction. So there are four types of externalities that we're going to go through, or four classifications. One is a positive externality. This is when that external impact is a positive. This is when that external effect makes that bystander better off. A negative externality is when that external effect makes the bystander worse off. And then we have production. And this is when the external effect arises from a production activity. And then we have consumption, and that's when the externality arises from a consumption activity. Now, if you look at these four classifications, you can see that it's really two pairs. You have a positive and negative. So an externality is either going to have a positive or a negative effect on bystanders. And an externality is either going to arise from a production activity or a consumption activity. So a good way to really understand externalities is to just go through some examples. So let's start with immunization of children. So parents immunize their kids, and that's a consumption of health care. They're taking care of their kids, they're consuming health care that will make their kids better off, their family better off. But that activity is going to have a positive effect on others, because if their kids do not get sick, then that means that they're not going to spread it to neighboring kids or kids at school. So they're protecting their kids, but they're also indirectly protecting other kids as well. So what we have here is a positive externality in consumption, because they're consuming health care, but it's going to provide a positive externality on others. Another example is research spillovers. Research is a production activity in the sense of you're generating new knowledge. Now, NASA or a firm engaging in research is doing so because it's going to benefit them. But by generating new knowledge and new understandings, that's going to spill over and have positive effects on other people that learn this new knowledge. So in this sense, you have a positive externality in production. Research is a production activity. It's generating new knowledge, and it's going to have a positive effect on bystanders. Another example is listening to loud music late at night. So you might enjoy listening to music really loud in the middle of the night, but your neighbor might not. So what we have is a negative externality consumption. You're consuming music, enjoying the music, but it's going to have a negative effect on your neighbors. And the last example we're going to go through here is a paper mill emitting dioxin into the river. Now, this is a specific example, but more generally you could think of any production activity or manufacturing activity that emits pollution into the river, into the air. This is a negative externality in production because the production is the activity generating the external effects, and those external effects are negatively affecting the bystanders. So now let's look at externalities in welfare. So first let's look at a positive externality in production. And we use the example of research spillovers. So first let's think about the problem. Research provides benefits to the firm, or NASA or some agency, and that research activity has benefits to the firm and has costs to the firm. But it also has benefits to society as a whole, those external positive effects. But the firm is deciding on their research activity based solely on the benefits it provides them and the cost that's imposed on them. Right? It's going to ignore the benefits that it provides to the third party. Right? So what we end up with is too little research from this market. And that's because the decision being made is ignoring some of the benefits that are out there. So how do you address this problem? One way is to adjust the incentives to encourage more research. We know that there's going to be too little research, so adjust the market incentives so that we encourage more. Generally speaking, there's a couple of ways to do this. You can subsidize the research by lowering the market price, subsidize the activity. That would encourage more activity to take place. Or you could essentially require action with regulation. So now let's look at another example, negative externality in production. So we use the example of pollution from a production process. So the problem is that the production imposes a cost as well as a benefit, but it imposes a cost to the firm, but it also imposes an external cost onto society or the neighboring neighborhoods. Right, so the firm is only going to consider the cost that's imposed on themselves, and it's going to ignore the cost that it imposes on society. And this is going to lead to too much production and too much pollution from this market. So the solution would be to adjust the incentive to discourage production and pollution. You can impose an emission tax or a pollution tax to increase the cost of that activity, to reduce the activity levels, or you could actually directly restrict the activity with regulation. Right? So essentially you're forcing the firm to take into account that external cost. And in that way, those taxes and regulations will make the market more efficient. So now let's look at a negative externality in consumption. And here we're talking about cigarette smoking. So here we have consumption, which is smoking by the smoker. It's going to impose a cost onto the smoker, but it's also going to impose cost on other people with secondhand smoke or health costs that are shifted onto other people. But the person smoking will tend to only consider the costs and benefits that that affect them individually. They're going to ignore the cost that is imposed on others. So what this leads to is that there's too much consumption and too much secondhand smoke. And again, we can have a solution that adjusts the incentives to try to get us back to equilibrium. Because as it stands now, the market is ignoring some relevant information. In this case, it's ignoring external costs. So we can adjust the markets to internalize those costs or force the individuals to take into account that external costs and thus make the market more efficient. So we can adjust the incentives by imposing a tax or that increases the price or the cost of smoking, but we could also restrict activity directly, right, by prohibiting smoking in public buildings, for instance. So now let's look at a positive externality in consumption. And we're going to use the example of education, and in particular higher education. Now the problem is going to be that the consumption by the student provides a benefit to that student, but it also is going to provide benefits to society, because society is better off collectively if the individuals are better educated, right? But individually, the student is only considering the benefits and costs that affect them, and they're ignoring the benefits that their education is going to provide other people. So what we end up with is too little education. So the solution, again, is to adjust the incentives to try to get the behavior closer to the optimal level, the equilibrium level that provides more welfare for society. And that would be to encourage more education. And you could do this in a couple of ways. Subsidize education to lower the costs, and that's exactly what we do with public universities. And we could prescribe activity as well by requiring attendance up to a certain level, like we do K through 12. All right, so let's summarize. Externalities lead to market failure. And this gets back to early discussions that markets work well if the price reflects all relevant information. But externalities, by definition, are costs and benefits that are not reflected by the market price and not considered by the buyer or the seller. So the market price is not going to reflect these relevant costs or benefits, and therefore not going to be the correct incentive for the buyers and sellers, which is going to lead to less than optimal behavior by buyers and sellers and less than efficient outcomes from that market. And of course, the larger the externality, or the larger the external effects, the larger the market failure is going to be. And we have policies that can correct this situation, correct the market failure, and you could tax and subsidize the activity to adjust the price to be more reflective of those external costs and benefits. And in this way, taxes and subsidies and regulations that correct these market failures can increase market efficiency and social welfare. But not all externalities need to be addressed with government and policy. There are private solutions to externalities problems. Sometimes individuals can voluntarily solve an externality problem, and other times externalities are not large enough to be worth a new program or policy. For example, social norms, which is essentially just being considerate of others, being aware that your activity affects a third party, and you adjust your behavior accordingly. So for instance, a cigarette smoker will adjust their behavior to minimize the effect they have on other people. So maybe they go outside on the deck to smoke instead of smoking in the house. Then you have people tend to not be loud at night because they don't want to bother their neighbors. And then drivers sometimes use turn signals because they know that their driving affects other people on the road. So essentially, you are taking into account those external costs or benefits and adjusting your behavior internally. Another mechanism would be charities and donations. Right? Environmental groups collect money for conservation. University alumni and others give money for scholarships to help encourage more education. Donors give money for research activity. And then people voluntarily participate in the carbon market. So this TerraPass programs where people voluntarily buy carbon offsets. Another mechanism would be bargaining. And that's when all the affected parties get together and sit down and come to a compromise, a mutually beneficial agreement. For this to work well, we first have to require that there's property rights and that bargaining is easy. There's not a huge cost to getting together and bargaining and coming up with a mutually beneficial outcome. So let's talk about this a bit more by discussing the Coase theorem. Ronald Coase developed this theorem a number of years ago, And what he suggested was that disputing parties can get together and solve an externality problem. And all that's required is that an initial assignment of property rights is given. Right? So he says if we just assign property rights and then let people get together and negotiate, then externalities can be resolved. Now there's a couple of problems here. One is that this assumes that there's zero transactions cost in bargaining. And second, how the property rights are assigned is a big question, because that determines the distribution of welfare and who's going to bear the burden of the negotiation. Right? So these are two issues that are important. The first one in particular, because there is no such thing as a zero transaction cost bargain. All bargains have some transactions cost, and most have a lot of transactions cost. So coming up with a compromise and a solution is oftentimes unreasonable. Transactions cost can be thought of or illustrated by the number of people affected by the externality. So if it's an externality where it's just two people that have to negotiate, then the transactions cost might be relatively small. But as soon as you start adding more people, 100 people into the negotiations, 1,000, even the global community, you start negotiating, you realize that the cost of negotiation and the friction in the negotiation is tremendous. And as we've seen with the climate change negotiations, it can go on for decades without coming up with any kind of real solutions. So that's a huge assumption. And Ronald Coase actually admits this because he says that he was not advocating that bargaining can solve the problem. He was actually advocating or pointing out the importance of transactions costs and how important they are in prohibiting a solution. While some externalities can be solved privately, voluntarily by individuals, many externality problems require a public solution, meaning a government action, a government policy, or an intervention into the market. One approach would be regulation, and that is what we refer to as a command and control approach. And that's essentially where you limit or require behavior, and what you're trying to do is target that equilibrium quantity, the optimal level of activity. Because without the regulation, that activities are going to be too low or too high, as we've gone through the previous examples, right? And regulation is trying to force people to increase their activity or decrease their activity and get it closer to that equilibrium level. Now, examples would be technology that's required for cars, seat belts for ones for safety, fuel efficiency standards. Neighborhood covenants is another example, so people don't have pigs in their front yard and affect everyone else negatively. Smoking laws, so we prohibit smoking in public buildings, even in restaurants and bars now. And then a noise ordinance, that's to help prohibit the negative externality of loud noises at night. Another approach would be Pigovian taxes and subsidies. This is more of what we call market-based approach, where you target the price. So what you're doing, you're using taxes and subsidies to adjust the price up or down so that the price provides a more accurate incentive of all the relevant information, including the external effects. Right? So if you recall, the externality causes the price to be too low or too high. Pigovian taxes and subsidies are prescriptions that adjust the price up or down. Like, so you impose a tax and it raises the price. You impose a subsidy and you're going to lower the price. And what you're trying to do is get that incentive to be the optimal incentive so the market can be more efficient. So examples include congestion charges, a gas tax, a plastic bag tax, a soda tax, and a cigarette tax, for instance, which illustrates that we can actually use both approaches. With cigarettes, for instance, there are cigarette smoking laws, but there's also cigarette taxes. So the third approach we're going to discuss is tradable permit markets. And this is a market-based approach as well, and it's essentially creating a market that didn't exist before. And it does so by assigning property rights and then facilitates the exchange of those property rights in a market. And this approach is generally used in the case where you have a negative externality in production, where a business or a firm emits pollution during their production process. All right, so before a permit market exists, they could emit this pollution at zero cost. And what a permit market does is it requires them, the firms, to have a permit for their pollution. So they have to pay to pollute. Right? So that provides a couple of good incentives. First, it discourages them from polluting, so they should lower their pollution levels. But it also gives them an incentive to innovate and figure out ways to perform their activities with less or no pollution, because they would like to avoid the cost of the permits. So this is often referred to as a cap and trade system, where you can cap the permit, so you can restrict the amount of total emissions or total pollution levels by capping the number of permits, but then you can allow the market participants to trade those permits amongst themselves. So it's a cap and trade system. The political rhetoric sometimes refers to it as the cap and tax system. Right? And you can see why, because the permit, in buying a permit, that's similar to a tax. Whereas you have Pigovian tax, you're charged a tax for some unit of activity. A tradable permit is, in having to buy a permit, you're essentially paying a price for each unit of activity. Right? So you can see there are some similarities there, but what's often not mentioned is that this cap and trade system, as well as the Pigovian taxes and some regulations, actually improve market efficiencies and market operations, and improves or increases welfare for society. Some examples of a tradable permit market include the regional carbon markets, SO2 markets, and the water markets. An early experience was SO2 markets, and the tradable permit system that was implemented was a huge success. It achieved the policy goals much more quickly than estimated, and at approximately half the cost that was estimated up front. So it's a very efficient policy approach to solving a negative externality problem. So now let's move to non-market goods. A non-market good is one that lacks the characteristics that enable it to be effectively managed in a market. All right, so there are different types of goods, and they are defined by two characteristics. Excludable, which means that the consumption can be prevented, and rival, which means if one person is consuming it, it diminishes or eliminates the ability of another person to consume it. And these two characteristics are going to define the types of goods that we're going to look at. First, we have private goods, which are market goods. So this is what we've been considering up to this point when we talk about market goods. Right? And they're excludable and they're rival, meaning that consumption can be excluded, and when one person consumes it, another person can't consume it. All right, so there are many examples: a car, clothes, gas, food. For instance, a car, my car, I can exclude other people from using my car because I have a key and I can lock it. The clothes are in my closet, so I can keep other people from using them. And gas, for instance, if my car is using or burning gas, then another car can't also burn that same gas, and so forth. Right? So these are the type of goods that we typically think about, and these are the market goods that we generally encounter on a day-to-day basis. That's not what we're talking about here. Markets work well with private goods. That's why they're called market goods. What we're talking about are the goods that don't have these two characteristics. And the first one we're going to look at that's not a market good is called a public good. And that's a good that is not excludable and not rival, meaning that you can't keep people from consuming it, and if they do consume it, it doesn't diminish or restrict your ability to consume it. So there are many examples. We have national defense is one, flood control, the justice system, fire protection, and so forth, a lot of those things are considered public goods, right? So, for instance, the national defense is not excludable because if I can't keep my neighbor from benefiting from our national defense, everyone is within the borders, enjoys that protection. And it's not rival because the benefits that I receive from national defense doesn't take away from my neighbor's benefits received from that national defense. So the third type of good is common pool resource. And this is the second type of non-market good that we're going to look at. And a common pool resource has one of the two characteristics of a private good. It is rival, but it's not excludable. Right, so examples include fisheries, clean air, and public land. So fisheries, for instance, consider the Pacific Northwest. So the U.S. can have fishing fleets and go and try to catch fish. Canada has a fleet of fishing vessels and they can try to go catch fish. Right, so we can't keep Canada's boats, or we can't even keep other boats within the U.S. from going to that fishery and catch fish. But if they go to the fishery and catch fish, the fish that they catch are rival, meaning that if they catch a fish, I can't catch it. So you can't stop people from using the resource, but if they do use it, it prohibits your ability to use it. And then the fourth type is a natural monopoly, and that's when it is excludable, but it's not rival. Right? And we're not going to discuss the natural monopoly case in this course. So in this section, the non-market goods section, we're going to focus on public goods and common pool resources. So let's look at public goods a little bit more in detail. The characteristics of the public good, being non-excludable and non-rival, creates a free rider problem. Those underlying incentives generate a tendency for everyone to underprovide the public good. The fact that it's non-excludable means that a person can receive the benefit of that public good without paying for it. Right? So everyone is sitting back waiting for someone else to produce or provide that public good, because everyone would rather enjoy the benefits without paying for it than paying for it and enjoying the benefits. Right? So for example, a dam is proposed to provide flood control for all the properties downstream. Who pays for the dam? Well, no individual has an incentive to step up and pay for it, because each individual would be better off if someone else paid for it and they got to enjoy the benefits. Right? So if everyone's thinking that, or if just enough people are thinking that, then it's going to be underprovided. That's why they call it a free rider problem, because everyone is hoping that they can free ride off the contributions or the provision of someone else. So they're hoping someone else will provide this public good, and then they can free ride and use it for free. Right, so that leads to an under provision because there's too little activity, there's too little contributions towards this public good. So now let's look at common pool resources. The problem associated with common pool resources is referred to as tragedy of the commons. And this is the inherent result of excessive consumption of a common resource. So the combination of a resource being non-excludable and rival motivates people to overuse the resource. They overexploit it, use it up faster than they really should. Right? So an example, if two boats are out there trying to catch fish in a fishery, each boat has the incentive to try to increase activity so that they can catch the fish before the other boat. Right? So it's a race to see who can catch it first. And in doing so, that competition that arises from the rivalness of the resource causes them to overfish the fishery and deplete the resource. So it's an inefficient outcome that calls for intervention with policy. Another example is overgrazing in public land. So ranchers have have access to public lands out west. And each of them have an incentive to use up that land before the other rancher allows their cattle on the land. So everyone's trying to use it up before someone else can get to it. And that's going to lead to overuse of the resource and a destruction of the public lands. So let's look at some basic solutions to these problems associated with non-market goods. First, we can have voluntary contributions that can provide or expand public good provision. Right? We often see communities raise money for new public projects like a park, and we often observe contributions to local volunteer fire departments, rescue squad, and so forth. Even though voluntary contributions can provide some benefits and some level of public goods, it generally falls short of what would be optimal and efficient for society. So the next thing that steps in there is taxes. And essentially taxes are forced contributions to these public goods. Since we can't rely on voluntary contributions because that free rider problem is so strong, we must require contributions through the means of a tax. And then we can have regulation, which can mandate behavior to protect a common pool resource. So for instance, we can regulate how often a rancher can use a public land. We can have hunting seasons or hunting limits. We can have permit or quota systems to manage the fisheries. So there's regulations that can help protect the common pool resource. This is the end of this video lecture. Please read the text, review your notes, and revisit any parts of this video lecture that you wish to review.